The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Department of Special Needs Ministries webinar on grief, loss, and the promise of new life, supporting people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities through grief and loss of a loved one. I'm Mary O'Mara, the Executive Director for the Department of Special Needs Ministries.
And good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Chung, Disabilities Coordinator for the Department of Special Needs Ministries.
We're so pleased to be with you together today, especially as we prepare to enter Holy Week to discuss this important topic. As the season of Lent moves towards remembering the passion and death of our Lord, we can recall Mary at the foot of the cross mourning for her son. How did the apostles feel after Jesus' death? Confused? Scared? We then move towards the joy of Easter. Imagine the joy the women felt at the tomb upon hearing Jesus was not there, but had fulfilled his promise to rise from the dead, and indeed his promise is for us as well. We know as family members, care providers, and professionals supporting people living with IDD that they experience losses as well. However, they are supported in their grief in ways that are not always respectful of the wholeness of a person. We hope in today's webinar to explore strategies and ways to support people living with IDD through grief and to realize the promise of Easter and new life.
And so Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." We have heard the gospel story of Lazarus being raised from the dead many times. In this gospel, Jesus seems to take his time getting to Bethany after receiving word the one you have loved is very ill. We meet again Martha and Mary, sisters of Lazarus and friends of Jesus, asking Jesus why he did not come sooner to heal Lazarus. Jesus is seen later, especially in this Bible verse, by the other mourners weeping. This is a very interesting verse in his gospel. Jesus expresses how most of us feel when we hear about the death of a loved one. Such a human moment in the gospel. Jesus fully divine and fully human. We grieve when a loved one passes away, but the promise of new life awaits us. And as we saw, Lazarus being raised from the dead. How can we accompany people living with IDD on their journey of mourning a loved one?
Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. These are words that Matthew gives us in the Beatitudes. Grief is something that we all experience, and as we learn from the Beatitudes, those who mourn shall be comforted. So this afternoon, we'll look at some ways that we might be that face of Christ for those who live with developmental disabilities facing the loss of a loved one.
Here we see an image about the corporal works of mercy. And as we may recall, one of the corporal works of mercy is to bury the dead. So what are the other corporal works of mercy? Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, visit the sick, give alms to the poor, visit the prisoners, and bury the dead. Showing love for others even after death is one way we show our love for God. To bury the dead, as we see, is the seventh corporal work of mercy.
We know that the circle of life begins at birth and ends at death. All of us experience the death of a loved one, a friend, a colleague, a church member. Our expression of grief may vary from one another in different ways. We all have our own way of processing that experience. Siblings may not mourn the death of a parent in the same way. This is true as well for people that we support living with IDD. Their expressions of grief may differ from our own, or they may be the same. Look at this graphic of the 7 stages of grief from Kubler-Ross. These have 2 additional stages added from the original 5. You may have seen or have heard about these stages of grief. Now, look at this graphic of the stages of grief. Isn't this how you may feel sometimes? Not a linear way, like in the first graphic, but rather just all over the place. In this manner, too, people living with IDD are not linear, but rather complete human beings with complex emotions. We need to figure it out. Rachel, do you remember studying these stages of grief in your experience growing up, the traditional Kubler-Ross stages of grief?
Yes, thank you, Mary. And sometimes we were led to believe when learning about these stages of grief, whether it was in a professional way or in a ministerial way, that somehow we had to go through it one by one and in this order in order to, let's say, complete that grief. But I think, Mary, we can even look back to our own experiences or in our roles as ministers or professionals that people are like the other graphic there on the right. Grief moves in all different places at all different points. And in some senses, I think, Mary, we can agree the grief will stay with us because that person is no longer there.
And so the second graphic is so much more of a human experience of what it actually does feel like, what some of those triggers for grief might be, how maybe hearing a song after you haven't heard it for a long time, or visiting a place, or even a smell could trigger a memory that brings your sense of grief or sadness right back to the surface again. Oftentimes you are very surprised by it yourself.
Yes, and I think we sometimes, even as, again, professionals or ministers, see people living with IDD just in terms of the behavior and isolation. Let's say a person living with IDD suddenly burst out in tears. We don't normally think about that experience as perhaps a trigger happened to remember the recent passing of their mother or their father. And perhaps they could not use the words to express it, maybe as you and I can, Mary. But if we take a moment to look at how the person is expressing themselves and think back to what experiences they have, even if it was 1 month, 6 months, or even a year ago. So that way we can embrace the person fully, not just look at that behavior as an isolated incident.
Another thing to consider is what are the certain types of losses that people experience. So as we are talking about loss today and people supporting people living with IDD, there's a wide range of losses throughout their life. So here are some for us to consider today. So the loss of a social connection, maybe after leaving a school and limited work opportunities. Rachel, would you like to give an example of this particular one?
So many people might recall that a person living with IDD is entitled to an education until the age of 21. And after age 21, there's limited opportunities, and especially in terms of work opportunities. So for most adults, that's how they continue their social connections, is through their career. But for people living with IDD, if those work opportunities aren't available to them in the same way, they actually lose many of their social connections. Their friends seem to scatter. There's not that opportunity for different events, such as maybe dances or sports events. So they actually lose a lot of their friendships after school because they haven't really fully entered that next stage of adulthood, which is work. And of course, which leads to having families and other parts of that experience as adulthood.
Again, changes in living situations. People living with IDD across their lifespan will find themselves oftentimes faced with having to move from one living situation to another, which could be, again, an experience of loss and leaving a place that they know, and leaving people that they know, roommates that they know. And so these changes in living situations often are followed by a time of processing that grief as an experience of loss as well.
So we know, again, from our own experiences, that people living with IDD also experience deaths of various family members, grandparents, parents, siblings. So as people living with IDD are more healthy and live longer lives, of course, they're going to face these losses too of family members. So again, these are losses that they can see. And again, maybe they can't fully express themselves using words, but certainly they can see at one moment the person was there and the next moment they're not there. So in regards to support staff, and especially as adults living with IDD, we know there's kind of this paradox of high turnover of staff. So constantly having that feeling of not seeing the same person support them, a high turnover rate. And also in other situations, you might have a staff person that could have been with the individual for 10, 15, perhaps even longer. And of course, there are times when that staff might pass away. I know recently at one of the Rosaria homes, one of the staff died quite suddenly. And of course, that was a devastating loss for the people that lived there in that home.
One aspect of loss that we all face is a decline in health and functioning as just a typical outcome of aging, the natural aging process. We all experience this in various ways, and all of a sudden finding that you are not able to do something that you were able to do years before. And persons now, as Rachel was sharing, are living longer with IDD, and these life experiences are also experienced by people with IDD. So learning how to embrace maybe an age onset loss of ability and learn how to relearn skills, or to be able to live in a new way, and not being able to maybe go for a walk in the afternoon, which is something that they were accustomed and love to do, and now they are no longer able to take a long walk. So these experiences that are an effect of a decline in health are also something that people will grieve and need a time to process and work through those changes in their physical abilities as well.
And also, as we mentioned earlier, oftentimes there's limited work opportunities for adults living with IDD. And that also includes lots of times being let go from jobs, Perhaps the job changed rapidly and the person wasn't able to keep up with those changes. Perhaps they were a person who delivered mail to offices, and then, of course, all of a sudden email and other forms of communication were used. So we shouldn't discount that when someone loses their job, how much of a loss that is for someone living with IDD. It gives them value, as it does for you and I. So losing those jobs and not being able to adapt is definitely a deep loss that they can feel. And of course, as we've discussed earlier, adults living with IDD, perhaps in some type of living situation, perhaps with housemates or other friends, they're going to experience this loss from time to time. People are going to pass away. And in some cases, again, the person might have lived with a certain 2 or 3 housemates for 10, 15, 20, even 30 years. So imagine being with someone for that amount of time and all of a sudden they're not there, and not having the opportunity to process that or having people to help them understand why suddenly one day the housemate is there and the next day they are no longer there. So it could be even that the people didn't necessarily get along. That does not mean that they don't experience that loss. So even if those housemates might have been having different kind of disagreements, as we can imagine in our own households, that really has become their family, as maybe other family members passed away or other families have moved away. So I think we can see that long-term housemates, or even not necessarily long-term, but short-term, that's their family. So losing them is indeed that devastating loss, similar to a family member.
Let's take just a moment and go through some myths and truths for people living with IDD and the grief process. So let's look at the idea that we believe that maybe they will just simply not understand the loss.
So we can, in fact, trust that, of course, there's different levels of understanding for a person living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But I think most people could see that, again, one day the person is there, their housemate or a beloved staff member, and the next day the person is no longer there, and then in fact they never see that person again. So even if the person's level of understanding is varied, of course they can again see and feel that something is different, and the person who was there is no longer there.
So maybe we might feel as though, or think that we need to protect them from this type of hurt, just as any of us will feel devastated at the loss of someone we love or a time in our lives, that let's protect the person then from this type of hurt.
And in fact, the person living with IDD should participate to the best of their abilities in all the rituals and remembrances that are done when a person passes away. Just think about our Mass and how many different roles there are in the Mass. Greeters, ushers, bringing up the gifts during the offertory, lectors, servers. We have so many roles in our Mass, and a person living with IDD could certainly fulfill any of those roles to the best of their abilities.
We could feel as though there'll be a problem if he or she comes to the service or funeral, or even a mass at home, whatever the ritual might be there, that there would be a problem might occur if we bring a person with IDD.
So in fact, we can perhaps think about alternatives that the person might be able to do if In fact, it may not be the best choice for that person to attend the Mass or come to the funeral home. We could think of other alternatives. Perhaps the person can visit the grave and bring flowers to their loved one. Perhaps we can take the person one-on-one to a chapel to pray, to light a candle in remembrance of the person. So it could be that the person could also make a choice of not wanting to go, and we have to honor that. And it could be that perhaps that is not the best experience for that person in order to mourn a loved one. But again, we can think of other ways that they can show their love and remembrance of the person, whether it be a parent, a brother, a sister, or a grandparent.
We might feel as though it's best that we make all of the decisions and set everything up and get everything ready, because it's really in the best interest for us to take care of all of the details.
And in fact, we need to trust the person living with IDD and keep them involved with all decisions and plans. So oftentimes people living with IDD, as Mary and I have learned, visiting different professionals and agencies, that the vast majority of those living with IDD are in fact living still with a parent or another family member. So when a death occurs, of course, they're mourning the loss of that person, but then all of a sudden changes and decisions are being made because their living situation has to change. Their primary caregiver has passed away, or the other parent is not able to care for the person. But that doesn't mean we suddenly make changes for them. We set up other living situations or ways without asking them what they want or what their input is in. Again, that's not how the person will make the best adjustment that they can if they're simply left out of the whole process.
So now we're going to just talk about some ideas for tips for support. So Rachel, why don't you start us off with our first one?
So as we've just mentioned, we need to include the person as much as possible in the remembrance rituals, funeral services, the Mass that will be perhaps held for the person. So again, with our Mass, there's so many different roles that a person can do to the best of their abilities. Perhaps a person can bring up flowers before the start of the service. Or in fact, I believe the person can share their memories. We all do that during those times of mourning. And perhaps this person can share their memories in forms of pictures, or perhaps other drawings can be passed around. There's many ways that we can express ourselves. And we need to make sure that the person is fully included in those rituals, again, to the best of their abilities. Also, that grief can be delayed as the person processes the loss. Again, sometimes we look at behaviors that people with IDD express, and we should remember that behavior is a way that a person's trying to communicate with us. So we need to think about that behavior as a way of communication. What is the person trying to tell us? So sometimes it can take time for that person living with IDD to process that grief. And it might be to us a sudden thing that months, weeks, or even a year later, all of a sudden the person changes, perhaps may become irritated or angry, or again, bursting out in tears. And we tend to want to look at that behavior in isolation at that moment, not thinking about the whole person and what has happened in their life.
Even those more quiet behaviors like withdrawal.
That's right. And also searching type of behaviors, perhaps weeks or months later, starting to rummage through things as if they're searching. And of course, we don't think about that behavior is communicating something to us, but it could be that person is looking for that treasured object, looking for that beloved parent who passed away.
So into that, we might want to even think about involving the person in selecting a memento from a loved one who's died, such as a blanket, a photograph, a piece of jewelry, a rosary, having something that will help that person to process the grief, and a tangible thing that they would be able to go to if they are feeling sad or if they are missing that person, to be able to have something there that is a reminder of the person that they loved. Pictures, of course, are very important to keep around and not to avoid, and not to feel as though we are not able to talk about the person who has died or remember them by looking at a picture. All of these are healthy ways to process grief, and ways that might help support the person with IDD through their process of grief as well.
And perhaps in our own roles as ministers, we have heard this before, but after the death of a loved one, it's advisable to try to not make changes or moves, if at all possible, for at least 1 year. And again, that's true for people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It might not always be expedient or safe for the person to be alone, but what can we do to try to minimize those changes immediately following the death, again, of a beloved parent or sibling, so that the person living with IDD is not faced with a sudden complete change, loss of a caregiver, loss of a home, loss of their neighborhood. So the best we can, we try to minimize that for a year, if at all possible.
And as with any one of us, too, if appropriate for the individual living with IDD, to seek grief counseling or a support group for that. It's important for all of us to find ways that we can work through our own thoughts and feelings. And for some persons living with IDD, not all, but for some, maybe seeking grief counseling or a support group might be a wonderful help and support in being able to process those thoughts and feelings.
And of course, I hope it goes without saying, we should be honest with the person. And my experiences and career, I actually met someone who no one ever told this individual that her father had died. And I thought that was the worst thing you could do actually for someone. And again, that comes back to that family members around that individual felt that was the best thing for her. And she constantly asked, why isn't my father visiting me? And I kind of was a young professional at that time, and I wasn't experienced enough to realize that in this particular case, that's not protecting the person. She's wondering, feeling more and more hurt inside, as I can imagine, because her father is not coming to see her. And people thought it would be too devastating for her to learn that he, in fact, had passed away. So imagine for yourself that no one ever told you why this beloved person in your life was suddenly gone, and no one was there to explain why.
Again, this might seem like common sense, but I think it was also important to regard the timing. So if there are planned assessments that are part of a person living with IDD, a part of their regular schedule and a part of what was going to be happening next, to be very cognizant about waiting, knowing that that person certainly who has suffered a recent loss isn't going to be at their best. So following the loss of a loved one or a friend or a staff person, that might not be the best time to schedule those various assessments that are part of a person living with IDD. It is a part of what they experience, but maybe putting off or rescheduling such assessments might be a wise idea, since that person may not feel at their best at that time.
And there are many excellent hospice providers. We have 2 providers, and of course, it's not limited to those 2 in our resource page as part of the handouts on this webinar. But certainly hospice providers are also there after the death of a loved one to provide comfort and support. So this is also should be afforded to the person living with IDD to the best of their abilities that they can participate. And also, again, we're concentrating today on people living with IDD, but also for staff in our different residential types of settings, those hospice services and comfort and support should also be made available to them as well, as they are providing that day-to-day care for people. And it's also difficult to see the loss of a beloved person that they have supported and cared for.
Of course, anniversaries of a death are a very important time. So honoring those anniversaries, maybe by bringing flowers to the grave or visiting a chapel, lighting a candle. There are various things that we could do. Maybe visit the restaurant that they had gone to that was a familiar place, something to honor anniversaries. So many cultures have different ways that they do that, either on a month after a loss or a year after a loss, that it would be important to remember and honor those anniversaries as well, and not to shy away from them or feel as though you'd be reopening the wound. Oftentimes missing those important anniversaries is also hurtful. So to be able to honor those anniversaries is very important.
And again, the person living with IDD may not want to attend the funeral service, and us as, again, ministers, professionals, and family members, we have to take a moment and listen to them, again, however they communicate their needs to us, and try to understand and honor that choice. It could be that that might be the best choice for them, but I think we've kind of shared some other alternatives that could be offered as a way to mourn and remember the loss of a loved one, again, be it a parent, a brother, a sister, or grandparent. So again, there's other ways the person can participate, and perhaps a mass, for example, might be just totally overwhelming to the person, and alternatives can be sought. So let's just take a moment when we support say they do not want to attend, and honor that choice.
What we'd like to take a look at now are just some social stories that might be helpful for persons to understand the concepts that are very difficult to understand. Often we're talking about abstract concepts, and so they might be very difficult for somebody who has a hard time with those concepts to understand, such as a major loss. And when we're thinking about that, it could be, as we have said, for a person who has died. It could be, too, for a pet who has died. Again, something that has been part of the daily flow of a person's life, a precious pet that has been there all the while, and losing that person. It could be a relationship ending, and as we were talking about support staff and turnover and the way that that works, or it could be even a sibling that moves out of the area for a new job or a new beginning. That is an experience of loss as well. It could be that an important life goal hasn't been achieved, and we were just talking about the idea of the importance of employment and the dignity of having a job, and what that might feel like to have your dream job and what you would really love to have, and not being able to attain that. Also, maybe not being able to do the things you used to do. Don't we all face this? So again, we're talking about those physical capabilities that might, with age, we find in declining health, we're not able to go on that lovely walk that we enjoyed for so very long, or other things that we enjoyed doing together.
So again, when we think about losing a loved one, it is a very difficult concept to explain. Again, the person was here one day with us, and the next day they're not, and we will see the person again in that way. So this particular social story helps to explain some reasons that people die. So it kind of gives us some tools to explain why is that person was there and now no longer they're there. And also important to mention in this social story, not everyone who gets sick will die. Because of course, again, explaining that even though that grandparent who was ill for a long time now died, just because your housemate has a cold doesn't mean that they will also die.
Some other things that social stories might help with is just the explanation of different things that if you are trying to explain, if you are alive and well, these are the things that you're able to do. You're able to breathe and communicate and move and feel. These are all things that people are able to do. When someone is no longer with us, then they are not able to breathe, they're not able to communicate, they're not moving around with us, they're not sharing their feelings with us. These are very abstract concepts to be able to convey when the person is not there. So using some of these social stories for these very abstract concepts might be quite helpful to you.
So again, we can use this particular social story to explain a funeral, because again, a person living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it could be, in fact, the person was never permitted to attend a funeral, and they want to do that for their beloved housemate who died. So this particular social story can help us to explain a funeral and what happens. So again, it explains it in a way that people are coming together. They're remembering and talking about that loved one and about singing songs and prayers. And again, this talks about if indeed after using this social story to talk about the funeral, we have to honor that choice if the person does in fact do not want to attend the funeral mass or other type of service.
The other thing that we might want to think about honoring through the use of a social story is how people might be feeling. So maybe to think you're finding it hard to concentrate, that this is normal. This is a normal part of the grieving process. So your thinking might change. You might feel confused. It's perfectly natural and normal to feel confused, or you may find it very difficult to make decisions. So talking about these things with the person who has experienced a loss, and if using social stories such as these small examples are helpful, then these are great conversation starters, if you will, to be able to talk through some of the things that would be very important and may help to ease a very difficult time for a person living with IDD. What we would like to be able to do is, if anyone has any questions or comments, if you could go to the chat box, which is in the drop down menu of your dashboard. If you would like to leave any question or comment in that area, we would be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. And we're going to talk about one additional slide and give you some time to maybe put any comments or questions that you wish to there, and we'll come back to this time of questions and comments in just a minute. Again, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please follow on your dashboard down to the chat box, and you may add your question or comment in that area. So I think, as we have been talking about, don't make choices for me, accompany me. Pope Francis talks so often about the many, many ways that we can accompany people through different lived experiences of their lives. Some of them are quite joyful, some of them are very painful, And in the experience of loss, here again, for people living with a disability or people living with intellectual disabilities, let us work towards accompanying that person and not necessarily making choices for them. We may often feel as though we are shielding or protecting our loved one by making those decisions. But the hard work comes in having those honest and frank conversations that really do uncover the wishes and or possibly the fears of a person living with a disability or a person living with IDD. We're called to those challenging conversations, but then to learn from those conversations how best we can accompany persons living with disability or with IDD. So we'd just like to go and see if at this time we have any questions from any of you at this time. And what I also wanted to do is, we're very blessed to have Rachel here in the department with us. Rachel has had a great deal of experience, 20 years of experience doing relationship and work with persons living with intellectual disabilities. And I'm wondering, Rachel, if you would be able to maybe share an experience that you had walking with a person that had a loss, walking with a person with an intellectual disability that experienced loss.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary, again, for these opportunities that we can share together our different experiences of accompaniment. And as we were preparing for this webinar, I was recalling a time where I worked with adults living with developmental disabilities in a sheltered workshop. And one of the people who came, a very joyful person, came in, very beloved, a person we supported at this particular organization for over 30 years. And for some reason, he simply died in the middle of the night. The staff went to wake him up, and he was gone. It was really a devastating loss for all of us. Again, a truly joyful person, always happy, and suddenly he was gone. Now, in the sheltered workshop, there was a person who really surprised us. He was a person we supported, and he had actually exhibits very aggressive behavior, and would suddenly change, and we weren't sure why he was exhibiting that behavior. But he really connected with this person who died, and really wanted to mourn them. Now, this person who we supported did not use words to communicate, but he kind of showed us through gestures that he did want to attend the service and funeral of the person. So on the day of the funeral, he came into the shelter workshop, dressed very well, with a tie and a collared shirt. And we took him there, and we weren't sure what was going to happen at the funeral. Again, this was someone who would at times express aggressive behaviors, such as hitting people and spitting at people. And we weren't always sure what would trigger that. But this person really showed us as staff how to mourn someone. He was very reverent, very respectful. Again, even though he did not use words to communicate, he showed through his reverence and expression the loss of his dear friend. Now, also through this same experience, the person who died had two housemates that they lived together for almost 40 years in one house, if you can imagine. They lived in one house for over 40 years, three men. And again, suddenly their housemate had died. And the agency that supported them in their residential services did not even think to send them to the funeral. I still remember this experience quite vividly, because it was shocking to me that you would have someone you lived with for 40 years and not even have the thought to bring them to the funeral. So we did, from the shelter workshop. We all drove down together to mourn the loss of this person as well. And interestingly enough, one of the other people who came to the workshop as well and knew this individual, she brought many pictures that she had of him and placed them actually in the grave. It was quite a moving experience, again, as staff, that she loved this person so much, and she thought to bring pictures she had with him and also place them in the grave as a way and a symbol of mourning. So again, all these individuals in the shelter workshop had not used always words to communicate, or very few words to communicate, but through gestures and reverence, they showed how much they loved this particular individual. And again, we talked about earlier in the slide, blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted, and also our corporal work of mercy to bury the dead. As Catholics, Christians, we are there to be the face of Christ, even at that time, at the final remembrance of that person, and be Christ to one another. And I think during that funeral service, those two people I mentioned were actually Christ for others as staff, so that we learned that blessed are those who mourn, they will be comforted. So we should never underestimate the people we support living with disabilities, and include them the best we can and to their abilities in all that process of mourning. And again, to walk with them, and their expressions will not maybe be the same as ours, or it may be delayed, as we discuss. It could be weeks or months later that they're finally able to process that loss. But for us as ministers, professionals, and caregivers, that we walk with them on that journey as well.
I think one of the most beautiful aspects of those stories that you shared, Rachel, is in the idea of being the face of Christ for one another. Yes, it's not just that we are there to support the person living with the intellectual disability, but in the great ministry that those that we are supporting turn around and minister to us, that they become the face of Christ for us in the gentle and beautiful ways that they are sharing their experience of not only grief, but grief is born of love, that it is in the loving of a person that we feel that grief and loss. And so to be able to enter into that experience and to really be able to be mutually transformed by one another, by showing and being that face of Christ for one another is a really beautiful way of being in communio, that we are one in communion with God and with our church in that experience.
And in our next slide, we have a few resources. And again, this is available as a handout on this webinar. And you can also contact us as well to receive this document, this PDF document. And I would like to challenge all of our church ministries to, again, include adults living with intellectual and developmental disabilities in all your ministries of grief and bereavement, again, to the best of their abilities and what seems appropriate for the situation. So here we have a beautiful resource used in our parishes. Just contact your parish to see if they have this Stephen's ministry available. And again, it's a ministry of accompaniment. But again, here at the Department of Special Needs Ministries, we have tools and ways for you to adapt your ministry and also give you tips and ideas on ways that you can walk with people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities in grief and bereavement. Also, as we mentioned, these are examples of two hospice providers in Montgomery County, Holy Cross and Montgomery Hospice. And again, through my experience, both of these hospice providers walked beautifully with individuals living with IDD as they passed away, and they also walked with their housemates and their roommates on that journey, and the staff, as we mentioned earlier. So these types of hospice services are available for everyone, regardless of someone's ability. So we can access these services as well. And both of these, Holy Cross and Montgomery, really show that walking and accompaniment in a beautiful way. And we also have a few articles with the tips we discussed, and two books that are available through Amazon if you'd like to continue and explore additional resources.
Please find two in the handout sections. There are handouts there for you to download, which will have a list of these resources as well. So please feel free to click onto the handout tab on your dashboard to be able to find the handouts attached to this webinar presentation. We're very happy to be able to talk about this topic of grief and loss, but not just of the grief and the loss, but of coming through to the Easter joy as well. As we enter into the season of Holy Week and our Triduum, and coming into experiencing Good Friday together as a church community, knowing that we have the hope of celebrating our Easter together as well. In so many ways, this is a joy and a hope that we have as Christian people to share with those that we love and support living with intellectual disabilities as well. That we are a people that live differently because we are a people of hope. And that beautiful message is something that we can carry with us into this coming Easter season. The last thing we'd like to share with you is just our next Lunch and Learn session, which will be coming up in May. Rachel?
Yes, so our next Lunch and Learn, again, will be the second Thursday of the month from 12 to 1 p.m. on May 9. And during our May webinar, we will celebrate mothers. We will invite two of our mothers that we work with on our ministry and that actually help Mary and I to understand that walking, to journey with them. So please come and celebrate mothers. We would love for all of our mothers and the dads that are out there to come and learn about that, about motherhood and what it means when you have a son or a daughter living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and how to walk that journey, and how we can, again, as care providers, professionals, and church ministers also journey with those mothers as well, and that we can be a place of embracing all of our families as well. And please be reminded that all of our webinars are available on the Archdiocese of Washington website under the Special Needs Ministry tab, resources, and all of those webinars are available. And you can certainly play those and see the different topics we've had. And also, if you have any ideas regarding future webinars, we would love to explore any topic that you're interested in this monthly series.
Thank you for being with us for our Lunch and Learn today. We really appreciate being able to be together for these sessions with you. As we come to enter into Holy Week, beginning with this Palm Sunday coming up just this Sunday, we wish you every blessing of our Holy Week experience, and we wish you every joy of our risen Lord coming together with us in this Easter season.